Hi, this is Liqian Ren, Director of Modern Alpha Wisdom Tree ETFs. Welcome to China of Tomorrow podcast series, where we navigate China, India, Japan, and the broader emerging markets with members of Wisdom Tree and other industry leaders. We have an exciting show today. First, I'm going to quickly comment on President Xi and Trump, their meeting at the sideline of APEC in South Korea. I think most of you probably already know that U.S. China had a small temporary deal that will push a lot of thorny issues for a year. So most of the issues that getting both sides very unhappy with each other is the rare earths, and then the U.S. putting 50% subsidiaries on the sanction list, plus the port fees for Chinese built ships. So those are all delayed until 1 year later, after U.S. midterm. I think what this deal means, if you remember the last couple weeks, is that first you have to have a little bit optimism on U.S.-China relationship, that each side still will reach some kind of agreement to take care of a very short run, snuff the conflicts. The secondly, you also have to be not too optimistic. This is not a grand deal. What's not in the deal is that Taiwan issue, which China really wants, and then the chips export, from the high-end chip export, NVIDIA. None of these got into the deal, meaning that both sides, for whatever reason, could be domestic pressure on President Trump, or could be that, like in China, could be that, it also want to delay Taiwan issue for 2 years and see what's going on in Taiwan's local politics. But ultimately, I think that is a good baseline, not too pessimistic, but also not too optimistic. I think between now and the next year, there will some flare-ups again. So we'll see how long this, peace lasts. Both sides are claiming victory. So that is very, very interesting. If you want more faster responses, you can reach out to us, to me on Twitter. And then we can, talk a little bit more pressing news from China. So today we are going to spend most of the time talking with Professor Tristan Brown. Fascinating books by him. He is the Associate Professor of History at MIT. He is the expert on the so-called late imperial, early modern China history. He has a book called Laws of the Land, Feng Shui, and then the state in Qing Dynasty, and talked about this part of our history, which is from 16th to 19th century, which I think for many people, including Americans and Chinese, it's not a very well-known history. Also, he is currently working on projects in another direction. One is the social history of Islam in Ming China from 14th century to 17th century. Another fascinating topic, because there are close to 20 million Muslims in China, which is, in China, it's a small percentage, but if you think like Turkey as a country has 85 million, that is an enormous number of Muslims in China. And also on environmental military history of the strategic use of ice along China's northern frontier. Again, this is an area where China is so different, facing many territorial invasion risk from the north, which people here in the U.S. really have very little knowledge of. So I think the topic is so fascinating, the book. Professor Brown, tell us what motivated you to think about research your first book.
Absolutely. Well, so first, Li Qian, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure after all this time. I've always enjoyed following you on X and hearing all your great analysis about China. So it's a great pleasure to speak with you. the first book really started out with, I was at the time doing my doctorate, and I was studying Chinese legal history. And I was analyzing lawsuits from the Qing Dynasty preserved in local archives around China. And, law is one of those subjects where it's fascinating, but there's been a lot of work on Chinese law. So, it's like, what new can you say about, property rights in China? There's so much good work on it. What new can you say about, whatever, taxation in China? There's a lot of good work on it. So, I realized, I said, an interesting angle are these disputes about Feng Shui, which, people usually don't associate Feng Shui in law. But in fact, legal cases in courts were a major arena of Feng Shui practices in pre-20th century China. And so that's what this book is really all about, right? It came to be that once I made that kind of conceptual breakthrough, that this was going to be, I was going to look at Feng Shui through the lens and the archives of law, and then I was also going to rethink Chinese law through the lens of Feng Shui. The book was going to do these two things and bring these two topics into conversation. That's kind of how it all started.
That's quite fascinating because honestly, even though I'm a Taoist and Feng Shui is one of the ritual, and I wouldn't even make the connection between Feng Shui because usually Feng Shui is considered kind of backward, superstitious, even though almost every rich family does it. Like if you well off, you will have use this practice. So can you share some stories or legal cases to illustrate your point?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's plenty. So there's 500 in the book. They cover many different arenas. But I think one thing which is really important, and Feng Shui remains important in China today, it remains relevant. But in order to understand Feng Shui in Chinese history, we have to remember that up until very recently, China was an agrarian society, right? This was a rural society. So people live in the countryside. They live close. Water sources are really important, right? There's no plumbing, right? There's none of this stuff, right? Trees are really important. Mountains and, just the general topography, right? All of those things, if you're living in a rural society and you're living off the land, there's another layer. It's just another type of relationship that's very, very hard for urban people anywhere in the world today to conceive of, right? So that's the first thing we need to do, right? So we have to kind of put ourselves in that sort of rural landscape. And then a lot of the cases that I have in the book are about like trees being cut down, right? So trees not all trees are equal, right? Some trees are grown for commercial purposes. Other trees are not supposed to be cut down. They have Feng Shui significance. They're connected to a family's wealth, well-being, fortune, health, all of that. So sometimes you'll have cases where a tree will be cut down and then a child in the family will fall ill. And the family will go to court and say, our neighbor cut this tree down. Look, my child is ill. This was a Feng Shui tree. We need compensation. So that was very common. A lot of cases were about mining, especially coal mining, right? So, people, there was a big population boom in 18th century China, and people are moving up into the mountains. They're trying to farm every inch of farmland that they can get their hands on. And that's putting great pressure on, whether it's temple lands or grave lands or houses. And so you get all these Feng Shui disputes. I'd say some of the most, if I can't, a few interesting specific cases. I'll just give you one sort of genre that I think is really interesting is scholars. So members of the Chinese gentry, these were people who were studying to take the civil service examinations and trying to become officials. They really cared about Feng Shui. And there was an idea that the Feng Shui of a town would affect the results, the examination results. So that was also a very interesting sort of, I have a chapter on that in the book looking at, sometimes like a tower, a Feng Shui tower, or something like this, or a bridge, or, a public works project that's kind of controversial. Maybe local people don't want it. They will be seen as linked to examination performance. And so you can get disputes where scholars are coming forward and saying, if we build this, it will hurt our exam results, right? And so then the state has to consider, how people feel about, their relationship to those exams. So I think that bears a lot of resonance with like, the Gaokao in China today, of course. So
if I may, I'll share a story which you may find fascinating as well. So my high school, because I grew up in Zhejiang, and Zhejiang now is so central in Chinese politics because, President Xi, was the party secretary of Zhejiang, and also Zhejiang, being the most economic advanced province, right now got so much attention. Forget about Alibaba, all the DeepSeek and the Unity, the robotics. But the funny thing is that so my high school is called the Dongyang High School, which is obviously the number one high school in my town. And our location was moved to a new place. And then afterwards, we used to have very high ranked, graduates within Zhejiang, because Zhejiang is so competitive. There are about, 10 high schools which are very well known, even nationally in China. So we used to be very top. And then after they moved, we are like going down every year in ranking in Zhejiang. So most of the graduates, including one of the top scientists, he comes home, for the alumni visit, and then his number one advocate is for us to move back to the old location because he feels that the new location doesn't have enough good Feng Shui, which in some way it echoes your point. I think in Chinese history and in many typical Chinese mind, there's this sense of harmony, the physical part, and deciding what's the natural part. But what I'm trying to understand it also is that is this something which like if you look at other countries or other like how these, I would say, like rituals or religious practice gets into how the state administers the law?
great question. So I think that, the answer is a little bit of yes and no, right? So there are things that are, of course, unique about China in this case, and there are things that are more broadly applicable. So let's take, for instance, the example that you just raised, which I think is a great example. I think, everybody sort of intuitively can feel that the environment of a school really matters. It really has an impact. There are some places where you just visit and you say, wow, this would be a great place to study in, and that might, and in the Chinese case, like all Chinese universities have like a pond, right? Somewhere on the campus, right? There's, you want to get trees and good places. In American campuses, we have like quads, right? We have like, why do we design buildings that look old even though they're not old, right? Why do we do that, right? Well, because we're trying to increase feng shui, right? We're trying to make this seem, it's not that like that will guarantee you get A's or something like that, but we're trying to like increase the sense of academic excellence. That this is a place of learning, and that attracts people, and that also attracts donors, right, to donate more money. So, all of this is kind of universal. The other thing I'll just say is, like, for instance, one of the prettiest campuses I probably have ever been to, Oxford and Cambridge in the UK, gorgeous campuses. In the 19th century, for instance, when the railway was being constructed across Britain, the Cambridge dons, they couldn't accept the train going into, their school. So that's why the Cambridge rail station is so far away from the campus. That's kind of similar to what we're also seeing in 19th century China of, all of the kind of disputes around industrialization that I also talk about in my book. So I think those aspects are really are really broadly applicable. I think those really are. But then of course, right, there's a lot of cultural knowledge in China. There's a lot of cultural knowledge in Feng Shui that was specific to China. Okay. So for instance, Chinese built with wood a lot. A lot of Chinese building prior to the 20th century was 1 or 2 stories. So generally we're talking low-rise buildings made of wood. That's why Feng Shui towers, Feng Shui Ta or, Fo Ta, any tower is really important because it really stands out on the urban landscape, which was pretty low rise, right? So those things, there's a lot of cultural knowledge in Feng Shui that is unique to China, that comes out of the Chinese experience and is in conversation with Chinese medicine, Taoist practice, you name it, right? So I think the answer to your question is there are some parts of it that are universal. There are some parts of it that are culturally specific to China.
So my other question is, I think for many people who don't know about China, Qing Dynasty is really one of the dynasty, the 2 dynasties, Yuan and Qing, were both ruled by non-Han Chinese, which is actually Han Chinese is not well defined, but there are a few minorities who are more prominently defined, like Manchurians, Tibetans, Mongolians, or Muslim Uyghurs. So Manchuria, similar to Mongolia, Manchuria is quite a pro-Buddhist, I think. And during Qing Dynasty, it's also I wouldn't say uses religion, but uses Buddhism to somewhat degree, because the Taoism is generally a bit anti-government. And actually, if you look at a lot of secret societies that goes against the Qing Dynasty, they were organized kind of pseudo-religious, pseudo-Taoist kind of a way. So I wonder whether in using a Feng Shui, which is has a little bit Han Chinese kind of a distinction, is that ever this so-called subtle against the government feeling ever seeps into those cases, or generally it's much less so?
Great question. So the question of how subversive could Feng Shui be, right? The answer is that anything that involved the calendar and predicting future events, of course, could be politically sensitive. So there were, there were laws in the official law code about officials should not invite the fortune tellers, directly into the government buildings, So there's sensitivities, no doubt, right? But here's the thing, is any religion broadly defined, like Buddhism, Taoism, you name it, can be subversive in some way, right? So in a sense, the Chinese state's reaction to that is really interesting, which is the reaction to that was not trying to separate from religion. It was trying to manage these religions. So there was a Buddhist official, right? There was a monk who would be the Buddhist official of a county, right? There was a Taoist who would be the Taoist official of the county. This system actually went back to the Yuan dynasty, if not earlier. The Yuan really institutionalized it. And there would be an yin-yang master, right, of the county, an official who's responsible for divination and feng shui stuff. So you could say this is a real Chinese, you could say governmentality, let's say, about what do you do about the religious question. Religion can be subversive. So the way you do it is you manage religion. And how do you manage religion? You create an official, right? So the official is responsible for making sure the Buddhists are following the law, the Taoists are following the law, the spirit mediums are following the law, the diviners are following the law, even the doctors, right? There was a medical official in all of the counties.
So are those mostly paid by the state, or are they How does, yeah.
Great question. So yeah, I just wrote an article on this actually. So they weren't paid. They were, generally speaking, at the prefectural level, they were kind of like rank 9. So they were the lowest ranked. I'm saying like the Buddhists, the Taoists, the medical, and the yin yang officers or officials. But I have to say that even though they weren't paid, these jobs I think were very lucrative to hold because it was a government position. It gave them power, it gave them prestige locally, it gave them influence locally. They could collect a lot of money by saying to the whether the monastics, the Buddhists, or saying to the Taoists, oh, we have to do it this way, oh, we have to, there are cases in the late Qing of, for instance, the yin yang officials or medical officials being totally corrupt, and taking lots of money and kind of fleecing local practitioners even. So the thing is that they don't get paid. They get appointed. They do have official seals, and their livelihood is actually based on the prestige that comes from proximity to the state and officialdom.
Actually, that's interesting because if you remember a couple months ago, one of the biggest news in China is Shaolin Shi, the abbot of Shaolin Temple, got corruption charges and then got completely replaced. And technically, he's not paid by the government either, but because he's the somewhat government sanctioned, and Shaolin Temple is just so rich, and besides, actually Shaolin Temple is probably not the top. In Zhejiang, because it's a rich province, like Liqian Temple and Putuo, they are very well off, these temples, because they were government sanctioned, and people go there and get a lot of religious services through these places, and they even has so-called loan business. They lend money to businesses to make money.
The moral of the story here, I think, that I think is really interesting is when we say, what is the Chinese state? And, this applies to the Qing Dynasty and it also applies to today, right? They think of, the Chinese state as Xi Jinping, right? Or the Chinese state as central officials, maybe provincial party secretary, or, everything. But we have to remember most of the governance in China and most of the officials are local officials. And they might be very low ranked, but they're, party members or, there's how many party members, 80 million party members or something like that. So it's really interesting to think about what is the reach of the state in China. And part of what I realized when I was researching my book on Feng Shui, and I was, thinking about the Qing Dynasty state, the Qing Dynasty state at its top levels had a relatively small bureaucracy, right? There weren't that many people who passed these exams. There weren't that many people who drew a salary, right, from their direct appointment by Beijing to, provincial office. But beneath them, there's this whole lower bureaucracy that is quite influential on the local level, and quite difficult for the central government to control, but is where a lot of the action happens, right? So I think even today, when we get to when we talk about, just my recent trip to China, or even just talking about what's going on in China today, I think that the first place we always need to start is what is going on with the local politics, what's going on with local officials, right? The central government officials can only do so much, so yeah.
One of I've been on Twitter, and I think now some people are coming around, but one of the things I keep telling people is that between central government, directive, the goal, versus local government implementation, there is this huge layers, and you need to understand what's actually getting done at the lowest level instead of, just looking at the central government. But one thing which I think many people have this question is that even though Chinese, religious practices like Taoism, Buddhism, is very prevalent, yet China never had a so-called separate power center of religion. Is that something which, like, from when you're looking at it, like, why is it because China's centralization was so absolute? It's just difficult. Like well, if you look at Western Europe, the religion, usually they are very, they provide the similar services, but they also a very, you can say they have a center power center. But Chinese religion never had that kind of influence.
Yeah, John, I really love the work of John Lagerwey on this, a great scholar of Taoism. And, he's got a book called, very provocatively titled in some ways, China, a Religious State.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And it's very interesting to think about, how, basically in China, what's amazing about China is for, thousands of years, there were always officials, there were always literati who would say, I don't believe in Buddhism. I don't believe in Taoism. I don't believe in Feng Shui. I think it's all nonsense, right? So China always has a secular dynamic, right? There's always no one compels anybody to believe in Buddhism, right? Or believe in Feng Shui, right? You can take it, you can leave it. But at the same time, China also doesn't have a secular break in the way that Europe has, right? So Europe, is like governed, by religion and kings and, popes and all of that. And then there's this moment where it's like, okay, we're going to have this separation of politics and religion. But China doesn't have that break because it never needed to have the break, because the idea was, well, there are all these jiao, these teachings, Fo jiao, Dao jiao, whatever. There are these practices, divinatory practices, medical practices, feng shui practices, and you can believe them or you cannot believe them. But it is the role of the state to make sure that they are being practiced lawfully. So, in a way, the Chinese state sometimes is playing the role of like quality control, making sure that like the monks are not corrupt, making sure that like, the feng shui masters aren't ripping people off, So that means in effect that the state is, a religious state, right? You know what I mean? In a sense.
That's a very interesting perspective. I have to go and read it. I think it's definitely for me, like, who's looks through U.S. and in China. You right now the party, actually, if you look at the corruption charges, sometimes a government official nowadays, if got accused, and will have a line says believing in superstitious things as a part of the corruption. And usually that means, I know that they never spelled it out, but usually it means they either practice, Taoist, like Feng Shui, or some Buddhist, things on their side. And actually many local government officials were very, you can say they were very, I wouldn't say the word religious, because the word religious is a definition, but you see that for a time, many local officials have this wooden beings, as part of the decoration. And then you go see local officials, and they all, a lot of them have that. Now they're much more. Now it's much rare because they got taken pictures and then this, but fascinating. And you also is also researching another aspect of religion, which is Islam in Ming China from 1368 to 1644. What brings you to thinking about researching in that area, and what do you think? Let us have a little peek of what you are finding for your future books.
Well, I mean, I say this as I was trained as a Qing historian, so I came to the Ming later. And I find the differences between the Ming and the Qing periods to be so thought-provoking and fascinating. And one of the big differences that sometimes people have assumed to be the case is that, the Qing is this big cosmopolitan multi-ethnic empire, and the Ming is this Han sort of monocultural empire. And really, that couldn't be further from the truth. The Ming inherits this huge population of Simu people who had come in the Mongol era. And basically, over the next, 2+ centuries, oversees their integration into Chinese life and society. And so the Ming is this incredibly fascinating era in which you have a lot of Muslims in China. They're living all over the empire, right, from the two capitals of Nanjing and Beijing, all the way, of course, to the west, and Yunnan in the southwest, Henan, and many, many places in between. And they're participating. They're participating. The Muslims are taking the exams. Muslims are serving in the Chinese military. And also, they're still going on Hajj and doing things like this. We have this incredible Ming Dynasty inscription in Persian, Arabic, that shows, like, in Shandong province in, like, I want to say the late 1400s, like, all these people who had been on pilgrimage, right, to the Middle East, right? So, looking at the story of Muslims in the Ming really, I think, helps us understand this, this really critical era in which, the China of today that we know is coming into being, and the role that Muslims played in that process. The story of Muslims in the Ming is already there just beneath the surface. Like Zheng He famously is a Muslim, right? So he's probably the most famous Muslim.
Yeah, the one who traveled around the world, the Chinese fleet.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. But I think that my book is going to show that, Zheng He is really not, he's the most famous example, but there's a lot of other smaller cases that are like Zheng He, of Muslims serving as eunuchs, Muslims serving in the military, as I said, soldiers, etc., in the bureaucracy, that I think will really change how we see the Ming Dynasty.
That's great. Actually, accidentally, as I'm trying to learn history as well, because I feel like, with the U.S. China relationship, I really need to, buff up my history. And recently, I've been reading a little bit about the story of Bai Congxi, who is a top Muslim general in the Chiang Kai-shek government. He's a very devout, Muslim, and also was very capable, but unfortunately, didn't get the trust. Again, it's very complicated when it involves Taiwan. But I think many people did not realize that he is a Muslim, a very devout Muslim. He always wanted to go to Mecca, but because of politics, he wasn't able to go. He died in Taiwan in the 1960s. So there are a lot of these personal stories, buried underneath, and Chinese government sometimes do not highlight them, because it wants to sell people a narrative. So you just visited China. Tell us what did you see? What do you experience there?
Well, it was really interesting. I had a wonderful time. I was at a conference in Shanghai for World China Studies, and then I went I was in Shanxi, I was in Datong for a day, and then I was in Dongbei actually for most of the trip. I was in especially Jilin and Heilongjiang. And then, of course, Beijing. And I spent a little bit of time in Zhejiang as well, in Shaoxing. It was my first time going to Shaoxing. Had a wonderful time. Hangzhou, all of the rest, wonderful. Very nice place. I think, well, there was a lot of things I observed. Just kind of starting out, I think one thing that Americans and people in the United States, especially in American universities, should be aware of is, I think the future of, Sinology or global China studies is going to look quite different in the next like 20 to 30 years. Namely, I was really impressed. I was really taken at this conference by the number of, like, let's say, Ukrainians or Russians, or even one or two Americans, but especially Ukrainians, Russians, also some people from the Middle East and Africa, who are going to university in China, right, for their BA, and then getting master's degrees, PhDs, all in China, speak very, very good Chinese, right? They're going to be influential right? Like this is going to be the future of China studies, actually, right? It's so, I'm not saying Harvard won't have a role in the future of China studies or Stanford or UCLA, but they're going to have lots of competition because there's going to be this other cohort, this other group. And I think that I was aware, 10 years ago or 15 years ago that there had been from, especially, starting with, the Belt and Road Initiative, right? That there were students coming from Belt and Road countries to China to study. Some of those students will learn Chinese, stay in China, like work in China. And I think that's a really interesting story to follow. Like, just like the lives of some of those people. I met an American guy who was like, my parents were just like, school in the United States is so expensive. Tuition is so expensive in the United States. He did his undergraduate studies in China. You know what I mean? So it's like that, like, the New York Times, I think maybe in 5 years will write an article about this. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like they're always going to be about 5 years too late. But that I think was a really interesting story.
So my other question is, when you are trying to study China, like from the U.S., which I still believe it's it's still at the very forefront, because when I read about, I have to admit I'm not very satisfied with some of the historical writing out of China, and now I look at it back and I think partly it's because when we were trained, like at least even when I grew up, when we were trained, we were not as religious in getting source right, to get the be very mindful of going to the original source. And I think nowadays, I think the younger generation of Chinese, after they learned in the U.S., it become much more aware of how to do scholarship, which I do believe. So in some way, I like the U.S. Approach of honestly, I know people maybe get mad at me, but I find that reading English or U.S. published books, I like those books more because it was usually more rigorous in terms of history. Yeah. So I think China has a lot, also have a lot to catch up on those.
Well, if I may, right? So one of the things that I'm thinking right now of writing a sort of popular piece called China, an Archaeological State. And one of the things that you notice in China is not all history is created equal, I would argue. There's a big love in Xi Jinping's China for archaeology. And you can see this, that in practically every major prefecture level city and above, there are new museums that have opened for the archaeological digs that have happened in the last 10, 20, 30 years. Most famously, we know during the late Cultural Revolution, the terracotta warriors were discovered. But since then, there's a million more discoveries, big and small, like the tomb of Sui Yangdi in Yangzhou. I just went there 2 weeks ago. Beautiful, huge museum, right? That is now erected there. So what you see is, I say this as a historian of the late empire, is there's a great love and respect and money for early history in China, right? Showing that Chinese civilization is long, is deep, goes way back. That's where the money is. When you get to history that is more and more closer to the current time, there is less of that same, let's say, passion or love, or, to put it that way. So sometimes I said, if you go to, any number of places in China, even though the Qing Dynasty was only just a little over 100 years ago, you can't see much from Qing Dynasty. But you can see all these people wearing Tang Dynasty clothing and archaeological dig from Han Dynasty and everything like that. This is this fascinating paradox of China's current love of archaeology and sort of its complicated relationship with history, right? especially more recent history. So I think like going there as a historian and seeing this like tension, I think is really, really interesting to behold.
That's really interesting, and I think you're absolutely right. Like Zhejiang, have this dig of the Liangzhu culture, which when I grew up, nobody knows it, honestly. So I think suddenly, it is at the forefront. In some way, it's probably also part of the President Xi's, love to talk about the so-called confidence in your culture, right? Like China is going through this huge swing toward archaeology, and you were right. I think actually a lot of Qing Dynasty things. U.S. is full of them. I think one of the vases my brother-in-law got me was exported from China to the U.S. At that time. So maybe one day things will swing. I think in some way I can kind of understand why Qing is not as popular, and also obviously even the after 1949 much of the history is partly is because when you look at the end of Qing, it's just so painful. If you look for Chinese, if you look at 100 years of history, and mostly is, war, and so I think people naturally shy away from that part of history. And then also from 1949, because the party wants to control the narrative of it. So, but hopefully when time passes, then the people who feel offended will die, and then the younger generation usually comes and study history, which is a little bit sad, because you should study the history when those people are alive and get,
Alive, of course, yeah. No, well, you can even see this just really quickly on, currently, I mean, it's kind of on pause right now, but there's the new dynasty always writes the official history of the previous dynasty. And the writing of the official history of the Qing Dynasty, which is ongoing over the past few decades, has been a very, very tense process. And it still hasn't been published. So this is the whole thing that I would say in terms of, just reflecting. I think for people in the United States or North America or Europe or elsewhere, Middle East, Africa, etc., there's still plenty of space. There's still plenty of, energy and room and everything to do really exciting work on late empire and modern China, right? So Ming, Qing and modern China, especially those areas that are harder to do in the PRC today. I think China is definitely leading the way on archaeology in the early periods for sure. So it's kind of interesting to think about.
No, this is really interesting. I didn't think that way, but it's definitely true. I mean, even like for me, I think China, even the history of right, from 1945 to 55, the period of transition. Many of those not really well studied. There are a lot of selective memories. This is fascinating. Again, I want to remind our listeners that we talked to Professor Tristan Brown, associate professor of history at MIT. He has this fascinating book. It's called Laws of the Land, Feng Shui and the State in Qing Dynasty China. And he's also, up and coming studies on Islam in China's Ming Dynasty and other military, the role of ICE, which we don't have time to talk today, but in the future, absolutely when you have the new book, I want to talk about Professor Brown. He is on Twitter at Tristan Brown, Tristan G. Brown. You can, read his book, and then, give us feedback. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I learned so much as well. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Liqian. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure.